Hi everyone, NUSensei here. In my time on YouTube, I've covered a few interesting topics and I've received a few interesting comments. One of the videos I did a while ago was, can you shoot a bow horizontally? And a lot of people pointed out that, well, of course you can. It's a crossbow then. And I thought, well, hang on, no, it's not. This is nothing like a crossbow. It's completely different. And at the same time, a lot of people asked, well, why don't you cover crossbows on your channel? And on a similar note, why don't most archery channels cover crossbows at all? So this video is going to cover the question of, well, are crossbows considered part of archery? Are crossbows considered to be bows? And why you don't normally see archers or archery channels include crossbows in their repertoire. For the most part, bows and crossbows are considered separate. Now, in many cases, they are lumped under the same archery umbrella. Historians and historical sources may describe bows and crossbows as being both used by archers, and in most cases, you would agree that a crossbow is a type of bow. But with that said, there are, in fact, many degrees of separation between bows and crossbows. From a historical standpoint, bows and crossbows are identified differently, and this is in their name and their function and description. Bows are, of course, the original tool, and you see this worldwide. Crossbows also have a very long history. Some of the very early crossbows were made during China and Rome and Greece that wasn't really widely used until much later on. Generally speaking, except for China and until the mass adoption of crossbows in Europe, archers universally were regarded as using bows. Now, from the same historical perspective, we can also see a bit of a pattern. Bows and crossbows do have something of a social divide. In many cases, the archers or the users of bows were accorded a higher social status or social standing than crossbow users. This could apply to East Asia, where many archers were basically all-round warriors. There could be the Turkish nomads or the Mongol warriors, the Japanese samurai. The Saracens and Arabs were basically all expected to be proficient in bows. So to be an all-round elite warrior, using a bow was part of your training. In the West, this was less commonly seen. It's more that the bow was a tool for the commoner. Of course, the lords and knights and high-class people could use a bow for hunting, for recreation, but as a tool for war, it was a weapon of the masses. But an archer was still afforded more privilege than a common citizen or a common levy. That's seen in the wages and privileges that, for example, the English yeoman archers received compared to other levies. The pattern here is whether you're an English yeoman or a Japanese samurai. Archery was a lifelong pursuit. You had to go through many years of training to become proficient in the use of a bow, especially in war. In comparison, crossbows were often given to militia. So the common person was given a crossbow. You couldn't pick up a bow and use it for war in a year. You had to spend many years of training. In contrast, the crossbow was more often given to commoners, such as militia or conscripts, and they required very little training. Like we said with the bow, they required a lifetime of training. Crossbows, some basic instruction, and you can use a crossbow. It was often derided by writers and noblemen. A knight that spent a whole lifetime training in the art of war could be killed by a single bolt from a crossbow from a farmer. So it was not really regarded as a particularly esteemed weapon. Bows in general were disliked by knights because it's not really man-to-man. But crossbows were even cheaper than bows in terms of their usage. We talk about like cheat weapons in the Middle Ages. Bows require years of training. Crossbows, pull trigger, dead knight. Now, irrespective of which bow was more effective for the particular purpose, in general, the trend seems to be that bows were regarded more highly than crossbows. Now, let's talk about how these things function differently. all bows or all bow types basically function the same way. It doesn't matter if you're using a horse bow or a composite bow or a compound bow or Olympic recurve bow. They all function by putting the arrow on the string, pulling the string back, bending the limbs, and then letting go and pushing the arrow forward. In essence, if you can use one kind of bow, you can use them all. I mean, you might have different techniques like thumb draws or Mediterranean draws or release aids, but functionally you can use all the bows. A compound shooter should be able to know how to use one of these bows with very minimal adaptation needed. Crossbows functionally are very different. Now, most people will recognize the distinction feature of a crossbow. It's laid sideways or horizontally, hence why it's a crossbow. It forms a cross with the stock. But crossbows aren't just horizontal bows. We mentioned the stock before, so one of the other distinction features is that the crossbows have stocks and they have triggers. Now you have handheld crossbows or pistol crossbows in modern times, but in most cases we're talking about a proper stock. And in fact, the modern crossbows, which are used for hunting, are basically assault rifle receivers with a crossbow. The fact that the crossbow has a stock and trigger means it can be cocked and loaded very much like a modern firearm. So rather than the user pulling it back and letting it go when needed, the crossbowman simply has to cock the crossbow and it's locked in place. And all it takes is a very gentle trigger pull to shoot the bolt. I should point out that the crossbows use bolts and not arrows. Bolts are different from arrows as well. So bolts are very short, they tend to be quite heavy, they might have two stabilizing fins or fletchers, whereas arrows are much longer. You can't shoot an arrow from a crossbow and you can't shoot a bolt from a bow. Another important distinction is that crossbows often have a much higher draw weight than bows, and especially in medieval times, the crossbows might be well over 1,000 pounds, using steel prods, for example, where you wouldn't use steel on a bow. That said, the crossbows have a much shorter power stroke. While with a bow, you can pull a bow back all the way to your full draw or beyond. You couldn't do this with a crossbow. Crossbows are much shorter with their limb or prod length. It'll be drawn much shorter, so you would have a much stronger set of prods in order to get the same energy for that power stroke. That said, with these heavy medieval crossbows, they couldn't be loaded by hand. You had to use some kind of mechanical device, such as the goat's foot or windlass, and that can take a lot longer. Whereas, of course, with a bow, you wouldn't need to use any additional tools to load and shoot a bow. Now, in modern times, there's very much a clear division between bows and crossbows, and some of this might be controversial. Firstly, crossbows are not included in archery organizations, federations, and associations. There's no crossbow category, classification, or division for World Archery. The International Field Archery Association, or IFAA, also don't have crossbow in their lineup. So the major organizations for sporting archery don't include crossbows. They pretty much have everything else, like modern compound, modern recurve, barebow recurve, traditional longbow, and so on. They don't have a crossbow division. And likewise, local level clubs, which are often affiliated with the national and international organizations, typically don't have a crossbow division if they are an archery club. Instead, crossbow events are organized by a completely separate organization which has nothing to do with World Archery or any archery association. There are a couple of major ones. The first one is the World Crossbow Shooting Association, and there's also the International Crossbow Shooting Union. And as I said before, because archery clubs are usually affiliated with an archery organization, you don't normally see archers and arbalists shoot together. Now, there's an even bigger reason why crossbows and bows are divided today, and that's legislation. Because of how crossbows are loaded and operated, they are often legally considered to be weapons. Depending on where you live, they might have the same status or regulations as firearms, and therefore to obtain a regulated or restricted weapon, you would need to obtain a firearms license to own a crossbow. This limits who can buy and own a crossbow, as well as where you can use one. Again, so some people have the impression that you can buy a crossbow on eBay, get it sent to you, and you can use it in your backyard or in your park. There's actually a lot more legislation. Again, depending on where you live, it might be a bit more relaxed, such as in America, where crossbows have the same status as guns in many cases. But in places like Australia, where guns are banned or restricted, crossbows have the same restrictions. So I can't buy a crossbow, get it sent to my house, and I can take it to my range. It will probably be taken at customs for one. And secondly, even I do somehow get a crossbow, I can't bring it to my club because, as I said before, because of the affiliations of archery clubs, as well as the legal liability of using a weapon on premises, you kind of can't use a crossbow at an archery club, and most clubs simply don't allow them because of the legal requirements to have a crossbow on site. Again, this tends to be an archery club thing. A shooting range might have different rules, and you might see archers and arbalists shoot together. But yeah, an archery club, a dedicated archery club, probably won't have any crossbows. Basically, if you live in a place where you can own a gun, then you can own a crossbow. Whereas if guns are banned, you probably can't use a crossbow either. Again, depends on where you live, but that's the general pattern. There's also an interesting footnote with bow hunters, and this is where the controversy really hits because, well, are crossbows guns or are crossbows bows? Depending on where you live and your local rules and legislation and laws, you might find that the crossbow can be used during the archery season, but in other places the crossbow can't be used during the archery season. So yeah, it really depends, but it's kind of controversial about who's allowed to use a crossbow to bow hunt and when you can use it. But the point to reinforce, crossbows are not considered to be bows by most people in most areas. And in the case of modern laws and legislation, they're usually considered to be separate from bows, whereas bows are normally considered to be a hobby or a piece of sports equipment, and there's usually no regulation on bows, even compound bows. Crossbows tend to be quite heavily regulated. To conclude, some people will put crossbows and bows together. But from what I think, crossbows and bows are different enough to be considered to be separate things. While they might fall under the same archery umbrella, in most cases, they're very distinctly identified. Historically, they were seen as different things and used by different people. They had a different purpose, and their method of operation was quite different. In modern times, the law will recognize bows and crossbows separately as well. The crossbow is a bit of an oddity. It is categorically a type of bow, but it functions differently to every other bow type. The technology of a crossbow has more in common with a bow, but the operation of a crossbow has more in common with a firearm. Anyway, what do you think? Do you consider crossbows to be bows? Are crossbows considered archery? Post your thoughts below. This is NUSensei. I'll see you next time.